Chapter 23. At long last, the Memorial Library clock struck a meaningful 7:30. The Swan was already abuzz with conversation. Pints were being pulled aplenty, and team members from the half-dozen pubs competing this year were already limbering up upon the row of dartboards arranged along the saloon bar wall. The close sign had long been up upon the Star of Bombay Curry Garden, and within the Swan, Gammon, in the unlikely guise of an Eastern Swami, engaged archie-karachi in fervent debate. In the back room of number 7 Mafeking Avenue, 4 men held a council of war.
"The thing must be performed with all expediency," said Professor Slocum. "We do not want Norman to miss the match. I have, as the colonials would have it, big bucks riding upon this year's competition."
The shopkeeper grinned. "Have no fear, Professor," said he.
"O'Malley, do you have your tools?"
John patted at the bulging plumber's bag he had commandeered during the afternoon from a dozing council worker.
"Then it's off down the alley and fingers crossed."
Without further ado, the 4 men passed out into a small backyard and down a dustbin-crowded alleyway towards the rear of the Star of Bombay Curry Garden. Norman was but a moment at the lock before the 4 found themselves within the colourfully decorated kitchenette, their nostrils tantalised by the heady fragrances of cumin, coriander, turmeric and garam masala. Carly's face peered down from a garish wall calendar, registering a look of some foreboding at the prospect of what was to be done to the premises of one of her followers.
"A moment, please," said Professor Slocum. "We must be certain that all is secure."
Within the Swan, Gammon suddenly interrupted his conversation, excused himself momentarily from Archie's company, and thrust a handful of change into the Swan's jukebox. As the thing roared into unstoppable action, Neville, who had taken great pains to arrange for the disabling of that particular piece of pub paraphernalia years before, and had never actually heard it play, marvelled at its sudden return to life. The Professor had left nothing to chance.
"To the wall, John," said Professor Slocum.
"Whereabouts?"
"Just there."
"Fair enough." O'Malley swung his 7-pound club hammer, and the cold chisel penetrated the gaudy wallpaper. The mouldy plasterwork fell away in great map chunks, and within a minute or two, O'Malley had bared an area of brickwork roughly 5 feet in height and 2 in width.
"Better penetrate from the very centre," the Professor advised. "Take it easy, and we will have a little check about, in case the thing is booby-trapped."
O'Malley hammered the chisel into the brickwork. Within the Swan, the jukebox was belting out a deafening selection of hits from the early 60s. The sounds of demolition were swallowed up by the cacophony.
"Stop!"
said the Professor suddenly. "What is it?" The words came simultaneously from 3 death-white faces.
"Changing the record, that's all. You can go on again now."
Pooley was skulking near to the back door. With every blow to the brickwork, his nerve was taking a similar hammering. His hand wavered above the door handle.
"If it goes up, Jim," said the Professor without looking round, "it will probably take most of Brentford with it. You have nowhere to run to."
"I wasn't running," said Jim, "just keeping an eye on the alleyway, that's all." He peered over the net curtain into a yard which was a veritable munitions dump of spent curry tins. "And not without cause. John, stop banging." "I'm getting nowhere with all these interruptions," the Irishman complained. "Look, I've nearly got this brick out."
"No, stop.
Pooley ducked down below window level.
"There's one of them out there." "Oh," said Professor Slocum. "I had the feeling they would not be very far from the Swan this night."
The 4 men held their breath until they could do it no more.
"Is he still there?"
the Professor asked. Pooley lifted the corner of the net curtain. "No, he's gone. Be at it, John. Get a move on, will you?" "Perhaps you'd rather do the work yourself, Pooley," said O'Malley, proffering his tools. "I am the lookout," said Pooley haughtily. "You are the hammerman."
"Oh, do get a move on," sighed Norman. "It's nearly 7:45.
O'Malley swung away with a vengeance, raising a fine cloud of brick dust and dislodging chunks of masonry with every blow. When he had cleared a hole of sufficient size, the Professor stuck his head through and shone about with a small hand torch.
"I see no sign of touch plates or sensory activators. Have it down, John."
O'Malley did the business, As Gammon's final selection came to an end and the jukebox switched itself off for another decade, the saboteurs stood before the exposed backplate of the Captain Laser alien attack machine. Norman opened his toolbox and took out a pair of rubber gloves, which he dusted with talcum powder and drew over his sensitive digits. Taking up a long, slim screwdriver, he teased out the locking screws. As the others crossed their fingers and held their breath, he gently eased away the back plate. The professor shone his torch in through the crack and nodded. Norman yanked the plate off, exposing the machine's inner workings. A great gasp went up from the company. "Holy Mary," said John O'Malley. "Would you look at all that lot?" Norman whistled through his teeth. "Magic," said he. Upon the dashboard of a black Cadillac sedan parked in a nearby side road, a green light began to flash furiously. The shopkeeper leant forward and stared into the machine's innards. "It's wonderful," he said, "beyond belief." "But can you break it up?" O'Malley demanded. "Break it up? That'd be a crime against God. Look at it, the precision, the design, it's beyond belief." Yes, but can you break it up?" Norman shook his head. "Given time, I suppose. But look here, the thing must serve at least a dozen functions. Each of these modules has a separate input and output." "Let me give it a welt with my hammer." No, just a minute." Norman traced the circuitry with his screwdriver, whistling all the while. "Each module is fed by the main power supply. Somewhere deep within the earth, it appears. This is evidently some sort of communications apparatus. There is a signalling device here, obviously for some sort of guidance control. Here is a basic circuitry which powers the game centre. Here is a gravitational field device to draw down orbiting objects onto a pre-programmed landing site. The whole thing is here, complete tracking, guidance, communication and landing controls. There are various other subsidiary components, outward defence modifications, protecting the frontal circuitry, alarm systems, etc." The professor nodded. "Disconnect the guidance, communications and landing systems, if you please, Norman." Norman delved into the works, skillfully removing certain intricate pieces of microcircuitry. "It occurs to me," he said, speaking purely as a layman, "that as a protective measure we might reverse certain sections merely by changing over their positive and negative terminals." Professor Slocum scratched at his snowy head. "To what end?" "Well, if this device is guiding the craft by means of gravitational beams locked into their computer guidance systems, if we were to reverse the polarity, then as they punch in their coordinates on board the ships, the machine will short them out and possibly destroy the descending craft." "Will it work?" Norman tapped at his nose. "Take it from me, won't do 'em a lot of good. Come to think of it, it might even be possible to cross-link the guidance system with the actual games program on the video machine. Pot the swords right at the sky as they fly in." "Can you do it?" "Can I do it, Professor?" Norman unscrewed a series of terminals and reconnected them accordingly. He also removed a small, unobtrusive portion of the contrivance, which appeared of importance only to himself, and secreted it within his toolbox. "Are you all done?" the professor asked, when the shopkeeper finally straightened up. "All done," said Norman, pulling off his gloves and tossing them into his toolbox. "Piece of cake." Professor Slocum rose upon creaking knees and patted the brick dust from his tweeds. He put a hand upon the shopkeeper's shoulder and said, "You have done very well, Norman, and we will be forever in your debt. The night, however, is far from over. In fact, it has just begun. Do you think you might now pull off the double by winning the darts match?" Norman nodded. He had every intention of pulling off the treble this night, but that was something he was keeping very much to himself. The Swan was filling at a goodly pace. With 7 local teams competing for the cherished shield, business was already becoming brisk. Neville had taken on extra bar staff, but these were of the finger-counting change confusing variety, and were already costing him money. The part-time barman was doing all he could, but his good eye wandered forever towards the Swan's door. When at 8:15 it swung open to herald the arrival of O'Malley, Pooley, Professor Slocum and Norman, Neville breathed an almighty sigh of relief. O'Malley thrust his way through the crowd and ordered the drinks. "As promised," he announced, as the Swan's team enveloped Norman in their midst with a great cheer. Neville pulled the pints. "I'm grateful, O'Malley," said he. "These are on the house." "And will be for a year, as soon as the other little matter's taken care of." "The machine?"
You will have to bear with me just a little bit longer on that one. Whatever occurs tonight, you must stand resolute and take no action." Neville's suspicions were immediately aroused. "What is likely to occur?" O'Malley held up his grimy hands. "The matter is under the control of Professor Slocum, a man who, I am sure you will agree, can be trusted without question." "If only as you say, then I will turn a blind eye to that despoiler of my loins who has come skulking with you." O'Malley grinned handsomely beneath his whiskers. Neville loaded the drinks onto a tray, and O'Malley bore them away to the Professor's reserved table. A bell rang and the darts tournament began. A hired master of ceremonies, acting as adjudicator and positive last word, clad in a glittering tuxedo and sporting an eyebrow pencil moustache, announced the first game. First on the oche were the teams from the Four Horsemen and the New Inn. Jack Lane, resident landlord at the Four Horsemen these 47 long years, struggled from his wheelchair and flung the very first dart of the evening. "Double top for Horsemen away," announced the adjudicator in a booming voice. Outside in the street, two figures who closely resembled a pair of young Jack Palances and who smelt strongly of creosote were rapidly approaching the Swan. They walked with automaton precision, and their double footfalls echoed along the deserted Ealing Road. "Double top," boomed the adjudicator. "New Inn away." Pooley and O'Malley sat in their grandstand seats, sipping their ale. "Your man Jarvis serves a fine overarm swing," said O'Malley. "He's a little too showy for my liking," Pooley replied. "I will take 5-4 on the Horseman if you're offering it." O'Malley, who had already opened his book and was now accepting bets from all comers, spat on his palm and smacked it down onto that of his companion. "We are away then," said he. "Ba-doo, ba-doo, ba-doo," went the Captain Laser alien attack machine, suddenly jarring the two men from their appreciation of life's finer things and causing them to leap from their chairs. O'Malley craned his neck above the crowd and peered towards the sinister contrivance. Through the swelling throng, he could just make out the distinctive lime-green coiffure of Nicholas Roger Raffles Rathbone. "It is the young ninny," said John. 5-4 if you have, then. I'll drop a page for you." Neville was by now moving up and down the bar, taking orders left, right and centre. The till jangled like a fire alarm, and Croughton, the pot-bellied potman, was already in a lather. No one noticed as two men with high cheekbones and immaculate black suits entered the Swan and lost themselves in the crowds. No one, that is, but for a single disembodied soul who lightly tapped the Professor upon the shoulder. "All right," said the old man, without drawing his eyes and match in play. "Kindly keep me informed." The Four Horsemen was faring rather badly. The lads from the New Inn had enlisted the support of one Thomas Squires Trelawney, a flights master from Chiswick. "Who brought him in?" asked Pooley. "His name is not on the card." "A late entry, I suppose. Do I hear a change in the odds?" "Treacherous to the end, O'Malley," said Jim Pooley. "I will not shorten the odds. Who is the next man up?" "Jack's son, young Jack, who was enjoying his 10th year in retirement and looked not a day over 40, put his toe to the line and sent his feathered missile upon its unerring course into the treble 20. A great cheer went up from the horsemen's supporters. "He once got 301 in 5 darts," O'Malley told Jim. "He is in league with the devil, though, but—" "True, that does give him an edge." Somehow young Jack had already managed to score 181 with 3 darts, and this pleased the lads from the Four Horsemen no end. To much applause, he concluded his performances by downing a pint of mild in less than 4 seconds. "He's wearing very well considering his age," said O'Malley. "You should see the state of his portrait in the attic." "I'll get the round in then," said Professor Slocum, rising upon his cane. "Make sure he doesn't charge you for mine," called O'Malley, who could see a long and happy year ahead, should the weather hold. With no words spoken, the crowd parted before the old man, allowing him immediate access to the bar. Beneath his table, young Jack made a satanic gesture, but he knew he was well outclassed by the great scholar. "Same again," said Professor Slocum. Neville did the honours. "All is well with you, I trust, barman?" the old gentleman asked. "You wear something of a hunted look." "I'm sorely tired, Professor," said Neville. "I can smell disaster, and this very night the scent is sour in my nostrils even now as I speak. It smells like creosote, but I know it to be disaster. If we survive to see a new day dawn, I'm going to take a very long holiday." "You might try Penge, then," said the old man brightly. "I understand that it is very nice, although
His words were suddenly swallowed up by a battery of patoos from the nearby games machine. Neville scowled through the crowd at the hunched back of the paper boy. "Perhaps I will simply say him now and take my holiday in Dartmoor, and say the air is very healthy thereabouts."
"Never fear," said Professor Slocum,
but his eyes too had become fixed upon the green-haired youth. Speaking rapidly into Nick's ear was a man of average height, slightly tanned and with high cheekbones. The professor couldn't help thinking that he put him in the mind of a young Jack Palance. The youth, however, appeared so engrossed in his play as to be oblivious to the urgent chatter of the darkly clad stranger. Neville chalked the bill onto the professor's private account, and the old gentleman freighted his tray back to his table.
"How goes the state of play?"
he asked O'Malley. "Squire Trelawney is disputing young Jack's score," said John, unloading the tray onto the table. "He is obviously not altogether au fait with Jack's technique."
"Oh dear," said Pooley, pointing towards the dispute. "Young Jack is not going to like that."
Trelawney, a temperamental friend of Dorothy, frustrated by the apparent wall of indifference his objections ran up against, had poked one of the horseman's leading players in the eye with his finger. "Trelawney is disqualified," said the adjudicator. "You what?" Squires turned upon the man in the rented tuxedo and stamped his feet in rage. "Out! Finished!" said the other. "We brook no violence here." "You're all bloody mad!" screamed the disgruntled player in a high piping voice. The crowd made hooting noises and somebody pinched his bum. "Out of my way, then!" Flinging down his set of Asprey's darts, the expensive ones with the rock feather flights, he thrust his way through the guffawing crowd and departed the Swan. Young Jack, who numbered among his personal loathings a very special hatred for gentlemen who bowl from the gasworks end, made an unnoticeable gesture beneath table level, and as he blustered into the street, Trelawney slipped upon an imaginary banana skin and fell heavily to the pavement. As he did so, the front two tyres of his Morris Minor went simultaneously flat. "This has all the markings of a most eventful evening," said Jim Pooley. "The first eliminate are not yet over and blood already drawn." The adjudicator wiped away the Newins' name from the board. With their best player disqualified, morale had suffered a devastating and irrevocable blow, and the Newin had retired from the competition. Next up were the North Star and the Princess Royal. The North Star's team never failed to raise eyebrows no matter where they had travelled, being five stout brothers of almost identical appearance. They ranged from the youngest, wee Tom, at 5'5", to the eldest, Big Bob, at 6'2", and had more the look of a set of Russian dolls about them than a darts team. Their presence in public always had a most sobering effect upon the more drunken clientele. Their opponents, on the other hand, could not have looked less alike had they been set out to do so. They numbered among their incongruous ranks two garage mechanic ne'er-do-wells, a bearded ex-vicar, a tall left engineer with small ears, and a clerk of works with large ones. They also boasted the only Chinese player in Brentford. Tommy Lee was the Grand Master to the Brentford Temple of Dimmack, and was most highly damned, even amongst very damned people indeed. Few folk in the borough ever chose to dispute with him over a doubtful throw. However, Tommy, who had taken the Dimmack oath which bound him never to use any of the horrendous, maiming, tearing, crippling and disfiguring techniques unless his back was really up against the wall, was a fair and honest man and very popular locally. He was also the only player known to throw underarm. He fared reasonably well, and as usual it took two strong lads to withdraw his hand-carved ivory darts from the board. "I'll bet that took the remaining plaster off Archie's back parlour wall," said O'Malley. "By the way, Professor, I hope the man from Bombay has been well catered for. We wouldn't want him popping next door for a snack or something, would we?" Professor Slocum tapped his sinuous nose. One or other of the North Star's men was throwing, but it's hard to tell which when they were detached from the set, and you couldn't judge them by the height. 100, bawled the adjudicator.
"What odds are you offering at present upon the North Star?"
the professor asked. Out of professional etiquette, John answered him tic-tac fashion.
"I will take your penny on that, then."
"From your account."
"John, you know I never carry money."
"The Princess Roni 156, boomed the adjudicator, taking up the chalks. The lift engineer, making much of his every movement, stepped onto the jockey. There was a ripple amongst the crowd as his first dart entered the treble 20. A whistle as his second joined it, and a great cry of horror as third skimmed the double 18 by a hairbreadth. Crimson to the tips of his small shell legs, the lift engineer returned to his chair and the obscurity from which he had momentarily emerged.
Unfortunate, said Professor Slocum, rubbing his hands together. I have noticed in matches past that the lift engineer has a tendency to buckle under pressure.
O'Malley made a sour face. He had noticed it also, but in the heat of the betting had neglected to note the running order of the players. Denostani's 87. Amidst much cheering, this figure was easily accomplished with a single 19, a double 19, and a double 15.
I am in profit already, said Professor Slocum to the scowling Irishman.
And I, said Pooley. Now began the usual debate which always marred championship matches. A member of the Princess Royals team accused the men from the Star of playing out of order. The adjudicator, who had not taken the obvious course of forcing them to sport name tags, found himself at a disadvantage. O'Malley, who had spotted the omission early in the game, shook his head towards Professor Slocum. I can see you're betting on this one being null and void, said he.
I might possibly intervene.
That would hardly be sporting now, would it, Professor?
Are you suggesting that I might have a bias?
Perish the thought. It's your round, is it not, Jim? Pooley, who had been meaning to broach the subject of a loan set against his personal winnings, began to pat at his pockets. You find me financially embarrassed at present, he said.
I think not, said Professor Slocum. I recall asking you for a pound's worth of change from the Swan's cash register.
You did, sir, yes. Pooley shook his head at the Professor's foresight and fought his way towards the bar. Neville faced his customer with a cold, good eye. Come to keep me in the cobblers again, Pooley? He asked. You are here on sufferance, you know, as a guest of O'Malley and the Professor. Jim nodded humbly. What can I say? Very little, said Neville. Can you smell creosote? Pooley's mustachios shot towards the floor like a dowser's rod. Where? He asked in a tremulous voice. Somewhere close, said Neville. Take my word, it bodes no good. Be assured of that. Pooley loaded the tray and cast a handful of coins on the counter. Keep the change, he called, retreating fearfully to his table. We're up next, said O'Malley upon the shaky Jim's return. Will you wager a pound or two upon the home team?
Neville smells creosote, said Jim. Take it easy. Professor Slocum patted the distraught Pooley's arm. I have no doubt that they must suspect something. Be assured that they are being watched.
The Captain Laser alien attack machine rattled out another series of electronic explosions. Norman stepped onto the mat amidst tumultuous applause. He licked the tips of his darts and nodded towards the adjudicator. Swan to throw, said that man. Norman's mastery of the game, his style and finesse, were legend in Brentford. Certain supporters who had moved away from the area travelled miles to witness his yearly display of skill. One pink-eyed man, who kept forever to the shadows, had actually travelled from as far afield as Penge. 180, shouted the adjudicator, although his words were lost in the Wembley roar of the crowd. It's poetry, said O'Malley. Perfect mastery, said Pooley.
I think it has something to do with the darts, said Professor Slocum, and possibly the board, which I understand he donated to the Swan.
You're not implying that some sort of electronic duplicity upon the part of our captain, are you? O'Malley asked.
Would I dare? But you will notice that each time he throws, the Guinness clock stops. This might be nothing more than coincidence.
The whole world holds its breath when Norman throws, said O'Malley, further shortening the already impossibly foreshortened odds upon the home team. Whose round is it?
I will go on to sherry now, if you please, said the Professor. I have no wish to use the Swan's convenience tonight.
Quite so, said John. We'd all do well to stay in the crowd. Sure to a round then. Rising from the table, he took up his book and departed into the crowd. Old Pete approached Professor Slocum and greeted the scholar with much hand-wringing.
My dog Chips tells me of a bogey in our midst, said he, and a distinguished one of the literary persuasion.
The elder ancient replied,
Tell your dog that he has nothing to fear. Mr. Poe is on our side.
Old Pete nodded and turned the conversation towards the sad decline in the nation's morals and Professor Slocum's opinion of the post office computer. O'Malley found the boy Nick at the bar, ordering a half of light and lime. Have this one on me, he said, handing the boy 2 florins. You're doing a grand job. Raffles Rathbone raised a manicured eyebrow. Don't tell me you now approve, he asked. Each to his own. I've never been one to deny the pleasures of the flesh. Here, have a couple of games on me, and don't miss now, will you? He dropped several more coins into the boy's outstretched palm. "I never miss," Nick replied. "I have the game mustard." "Good boy. 2 guard watches and a small sweet cherry, please, Neville." The part-time barman glared at O'Malley. "You're paying for these," he snarled. "I still have my suspicions." "You can pay me back later," O'Malley replied, delving into his pockets. "I am a man of my word." "And I mine. 18 and 6, please." "Do you know something I don't?" Nick asked the Irishman. "A good many things. Do you have anything specific in mind?" "About the machine?" "Nothing. Is something troubling you?" Nick shook his limey head and turned his prodigious nose once more towards the unoccupied machine. "I must be going now," he said. "The captain awaits." "You buffoon," said O'Malley beneath his breath. By the time he returned to the table, the Swans team had disposed of their adversaries in no uncertain fashion. "I am sure that I am up at least 2 bob on that game," said Pooley. 2 and 4pence, said Professor Slocum. "Don't let it go to your head." The final eliminating match lay between the 4 Horsemen and the Albany Arms, whose team of old stalwarts, each a veteran of Gallipoli, had been faring remarkably well against spirited opposition. "Albany Arms to throw!" boomed himself. "Leave me out of this one," said Pooley. "Unless God chooses to intervene upon this occasion and dispatch young Jack into bottomless pit, I feel it to be a foregone conclusion." "I will admit, you'd have to wager at least £100 to win yourself another 2 and 4pence. Don't you feel that 1,000 to 1 against the Albany is a little cruel? But nevertheless, tempting to the outside better." "Taking money from children," said Professor Slocum. "How can you live with yourself, John?" O'Malley grinned beneath his beard. "Please do not deny me my livelihood," said he. From their first start onwards, the Albany began to experience inexplicable difficulties with their game. Several of the normally robust geriatrics became suddenly subject to unexpected bouts of incontinence at their moments of throwing. Others mislaid their darts or spilled their beer. One even locked himself in the gents and refused to come out until the great grinning black goat was removed from in front of the dartboard. It was remarkable the effect that young Jack could have upon his team's opponents. The crowd, however, was not impressed. Being responsive only to the finer points of the game and ever alert to such blatant skullduggery, they viewed this degrading spectacle with outrage and turned their backs upon the board. Young Jack could not have cared less. The 4 Horsemen needed but a double 13 to take the match, and the Albany had yet to get away. The present-day Faust smirked over towards the Professor and made an obscene gesture. Professor Slocum shook his head and made clicking noises with his tongue. "Most unsporting," said he. "I shall see to it that none of this occurs in the final." Without waiting to watch the inevitable outcome of the game, he rose from his chair and took himself off to where the Swans team stood in a noisy scrum, ignoring the play. "He has gone to bless the darts, I suspect," said O'Malley. "In his yearly battle of wits for young Jack, the Professor leaves nothing to chance." "Do you believe it possible," Pooley asked wistfully, "that somewhere in this green and pleasant land of ours, this sceptred isle, this jewel set in a silver sea and whatever, that there might somewhere be a little darts team, based possibly in some obscure half-timbered country pub out in the sticks, which actually plays the game for the love of it alone, and without having recourse to some underhand jiggery-pokery?" "Are you mad?" inquired O'Malley, "or merely drunk?" Jim shook his head. "I just wondered how such a game might look, if played by skill alone, I mean." "Jolly dull, I should think. Here, take this £1 note, which you can owe me, and get in another round." Jim watched a moment as young Jack's hellish black dart cleaved the air, leaving a yellow vapour trail, and thrust its oily nose into the double 13. "I should like to see it," he said, "just once." "Naive boy," sighed O'Malley, running his pencil down endless columns of figures, and wondering by how many thousands of pounds he was up this particular evening. Professor Slocum finished muttering a Latin text over the table of laid-out darts, and gave the benediction. "This will not, of course, enable you to play any better," he explained, "but it will protect your darts from the mysterious deflections which might occur." The Swans team nodded. They had defeated the 4 Horsemen in the final 5 years on the trot now, which was, by way of coincidence, exactly the length of time that the Professor had been acting as honorary president. They took the old man's words strictly at their face value. None of the accidents which marred the play of the Horsemen's other opponents ever befell them, and although few of the team knew anything whatever about the occult, each blessed the day that Norman had suggested the elderly scholar's nomination.
Be warned now, Professor Slocum continued. He does appear to be on superb form tonight. Look wherever you like, but avoid his eyes.
Neville appeared through the crowd bearing a silver tray. On this rested a dozen twinkling champagne saucers and a Georgian silver wine cooler containing a chilled and vintage bottle of Paul Roger. This little morale booster was another of the Professor's inspirations. "Good luck to you all," said the part-time barman, patting Norman gingerly upon the shoulder. "Good luck." A warlike conclave had formed at the other end of the bar. Young Jack and his demonic cohorts were clustered about old Jack's wheelchair, speaking in hushed, if heated, tones. Neville sensed that above the smell of creosote, which so strongly assailed his sensitive nostrils, there was a definite whiff of brimstone emanating from the satanic conspirators. The part-time barman shuddered. Why did things always have to be so complicated? The Swan now swelled with crowds literally to bursting point. It was almost impossible to move amongst the throng, and trayloads of drinks were being passed from the bar counter over heads of patrons, generally to arrive at their destination somewhat lighter of cargo. It was rapidly reaching the every man for himself stage. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation and unbreathable with cigar smoke. The noise was deafening, and even the Captain Laser alien attack machine rattled mutely, lost amidst the din. Croton, the pot-bellied popman, had come down with a severe attack of no bottle and had taken himself off to the rear yard for a quiet cigarette. "Ladies and gentlemen," bellowed the adjudicator at the top of his voice, "it is my pleasure to announce the final and deciding contest of the evening, the very climax of this evening's sport." O'Malley noted that the word sport appeared to stick slightly in the adjudicator's throat. "The final for the much-coveted Brentford District Darts Challenge Trophy Shield." Neville, who had taken this cherished item down from its cobwebby perch above the bar and had carefully polished its tarnished surface before secreting it away in a place known only to himself, held it aloft in both hands. A great cheer rang through the Swan. "Between the present holders, 5 years champions, the home team, the Flying Swan," another deafening cheer, "and their challengers from the Four Horsemen." Absolute silence, but for the occasional "Patoo" in the background. "Gentlemen, let battle commence." The home team, as reigning champions, had call of the toss. As the adjudicator flipped a copper coin high into the unwholesome smoke-filled air, Professor Slocum, who had taken up station slightly to the rear of young Jack, whispered, "The same coin had better come down, and it had better not land upon its edge." Young Jack leered around at his adversary. "As honorary president," he said, "I shall look forward to you personally handing me the shield upon your team's crushing defeat." Whether through the action of that fickle thing called fate, or through the influence of some force which the Professor had neglected to make allowance for, unlikely though that might seem, the coin fell tail-side up and the Four Horsemen were the first upon the hockey. Through merit of his advanced years and the ever-present possibility that he would not survive another championship game through to the end, old Jack threw first. Professor Slocum did not trouble to watch the ancient as he struggled from his wheelchair, assisted by his two aides, and flung his darts. His eyes were glued to the hands of young Jack, awaiting the slightest movement amongst the Dark Captain's metaphysical digits. It was 501 up, and a 5-game decision, and each man playing was determined to give of his all or die in the giving. Old Jack gave a fair account of himself with an ample ton. Norman took the mat. As he did so, both Pooley and O'Malley found their eyes wandering involuntarily over the heads of the crowd towards the electric Guinness clock. 3 times Norman threw, and 3 times did those 2 pairs of eyes observe the fluctuation in the clock's hand. "He cheats, you know," whispered Pooley. "I've heard it rumoured," O'Malley replied. 180, boomed the man in the rented tux.